Good evening. I want to welcome you and our online viewers to Ryan Observatory's monthly open house. You may have received a notice, and one of my good golfing buddy friends and a fellow who's in the hazardous waste remediation area sent me a note upon receiving that notice. And it was interesting because that note captured a fair amount of what we're trying to do here. And I'll just read it for you. It said, art and science are intrinsically and by nature intertwined. The simplistic, magnificent beauty of nature gets analyzed and synthesized by science, which then provides a very exciting view of the universe and the world around us for everyone to see. It's quite surprised coming from this particular fellow, but it's our belief here as well that whether you fancy yourself an artist or scientist or neither, you should have no fear in having an appreciation of both. This observatory venture started with Constellation's notion that it needs to bring more STEM resources to the community. And the result is we have this wonderful facility. But after a while, we were informed, I might say quite rudely by some people, that this facility was not for people who were not in the arts, who were in the arts, not in the sciences, and classrooms and workplaces and everywhere else that didn't deal with art particularly or science particularly. And I want to just tell everybody right here and now, that is not the case. It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight both an artist and a scientist. I believe that as we listen in on their conversation, you'll find that the back and forth that you hear from them will enable you to get an appreciation for how art and science are basically two sides of the same coin. Hopefully we'll get some feedback that'll help us continue with our arts and science programming to further benefit the community. Now let me tell you about our guests. First off, Scott Edward Anderson. He's the first Ryan Observatory Poet Laureate. I'll let him explain what that is. He's an award-winning poet, he's a memoirist, he's an essayist, a translator, and he's agreed to help us in developing initiatives for emphasizing the arts in our observatory's STEM program, basically taking us from STEM to STEAM. And for those of you who aren't in the know, STEM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, and the A for Arts makes it STEAM. He's best known for his keen observations of the natural world, often in his science-based focused poetry. Much of his poetry was informed by his 15 years in biodiversity conservation, working alongside biologists, climate scientists, ecologists at the Nature Conservancy. He learned firsthand about individual species, their habitats and their ecosystems, and our human impact on the environment. You can hear the result of that experience in the precision in which is within his writings, and we'll have more on that later. That precision is both artistic and scientific. That's my own opinion. Anderson uses words to tell stories, bring communities together, and raise the bar for new approaches to art. I know he'll use his talents to show that our community, the immense power of poetry to not just art, science, but also to critical thinking. Scott has been a Concordia Fellow at Malay Arts. He received the Letras Levatas Panasaurus Award, the Nebraska Review Award, and the Larry Aldrich Emerging Poets Award. He's the author of 4 books of poetry and 2 books of nonfiction. He'll stick around after the presentation to talk with you about just about anything that's on your mind. And he'll do that while he's autographing his books out in the main lobby. Scott and his family spend a part of the year in Massachusetts and a part of the year in the Azores. Dr. Derrick Pitts I told him before we got here that my bio is out of date, and he proceeded to tell me about all the things he's done since then, but I won't get into that. The senior scientist, planetarium programs director, exhibit director at the Franklin Institute of Science Museum, and of course, the chief astronomer at the Franklin Institute. He's also the founder and president of the Planetarium Production Alliance, and is an ambassador for NASA's programs and outreach ambassador for the huge 30-meter telescope to be built in Hawaii. He's a scientific consultant to many organizations and has written numerous astronomy columns for newspapers and national magazines. He appears regularly on all the major television networks as a science content expert, and for more than a decade has hosted the award-winning astronomy radio programs on Philadelphia's WHYY 91 FM. Among his many awards, the Mayor's Liberty Bell, the St. Lawrence University Distinguished Alumni Award, the G.W. Carver Medal, the Please Touch Museum's Great Friend to Kids Award, induction into the Germantown Historical Hall of Fame, selection as one of the 50 most important Blacks in research science by Science Spectrum magazine, 2005 Men Making a Difference in the Community Award for Excellence in Science and Technology from the Legacy of Love Foundation. Dr. Pitts has also served as the University Honors Committee Chair on the Board of Trustees for his alma mater, St. Lawrence University, and is president of Tuskegee Airmen, Inc., the Philadelphia chapter. Now, I could go on with Derrick's associations and accomplishments, but I'll stop here, except to say that while England has its Astronomer Royal, Ryan Observatory has Dr. Derrick Pitts.
Thank you. That's great. Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
After their conversation, we'll be listening in, peeking through the keyhole and looking through the window. We'll have a short Q&A, and then we'll retire. We can talk to Scott about his books and maybe bag a few while we're out there. And Ted Williams, Rittenhouse Astronomical Society president, will be hosting a night sky tour, and of course the observatories will be open. So with that, I'll let you listen in.
All right. Well, thank you, Al. And I want to thank the Arts Committee also for asking me to be the first Poet Laureate of Ryan Observatory. Al and I actually go quite a bit back, I think about 20 years, maybe a little bit more, when I was working for the Nature Conservancy in Pennsylvania, and asked Al to join the board. And we got to know each other pretty well back then. And I don't think either of us ever dreamed that we'd be sharing a stage like this, and Al would be introducing me as a writer. And but I'm so thankful that we had this opportunity. Just a little bit about what a Poet Laureate is. It's basically a fancy word of secretary. So I'm going to be helping the Arts Committee think about ways to bring poetry into the observatory, onto the grounds, into the programming. But not only poetry, we're also looking at music. We're looking at bringing in art, photography. So there's a range of things that we're thinking about. And one of which is going to be a poetry path. We'll have displays of poetry along the path around here, and then probably into the park in coming years. And we'll choose poetry that will relate to science, will relate to the landscape, will relate to the local place as much as possible, and the night sky, obviously. And we'll have a nice display where people can read the poem, they can engage with the poem. There'll be a prompt to think about it or write about it or make your own observations. And so that's the type of thing that we're going to try to do. And but what inspired me to do this conversation was a dialogue between the former U.S. Poet Laureate, and who was also an old teacher of mine, Robert Hass, and E.O. Wilson, who Dr. E.O. Wilson, who was a renowned myrmecologist and was on the board of governors of the Nature Conservancy. So I got to know him pretty well in that capacity. And they had a dialogue together at the Museum of Natural History in New York in 2012. And in that conversation, they explored the gap between the arts or humanities and science, which really dates from the Enlightenment. That was sort of when the break started. And their conclusion was, we really need to bridge the two in order to tackle this enormous threat that faces all of us and our planet, our only planet, which is climate change. And so that in part is why we're here, as part of Ryan Observatory's efforts to add an A to STEM and make it STEAM. We should steam along pretty well, I think, with our dialogue. We had a pre-call the other day, so we're not coming here completely fresh and just going to expound, but maybe a little bit of that.
A little bit, yeah, we should.
So in that dialogue, Robert Hass said that artists almost always start with a kind of play based on elements that are fixed and variable. Things that connections express, set forms in music, set patterns in comedy, fixed rhythms in poetry on the one hand, and on the other, departure from those connections that lead to new ways of seeing and thinking and feeling. And it seems to me that science starts in a similar fashion, or at least the scientific method. Would you say that's true, Derrick, or would you challenge that assumption?
That is a good question. I don't know if I would challenge the assumption so much as to maybe add to it in an interesting way. You mentioned those factors that sort of set it up, and if I try to think of science in a similar way, the things that come to mind for me are curiosity and imagination. Two things that I think science is based in for people who are just coming to science or interested in science. It's your curiosity about the world around you or about any phenomenon happening around you. And then there's the imagination that goes beyond the curiosity of what if, what could be. And I think when we begin to dissect science, we maybe lose sight of these two basic things of curiosity and imagination, because we typically tend to immediately go to the applied side of science. And that then becomes fraught with all kinds of other issues and difficulties and problems. But when you just break it down for what it is or why it is that the folks that are in science, it's because of that. They're curious. They're very curious. Now, I use the word curiosity in sort of a simplified fashion, but no matter how far out you go or up the ladder you go in complexity, what's happening in science is trying to understand the immediate surrounding, or the surrounding environment, not even immediate, but the universe that we live in. And that universe is everywhere from the micro universe to the macro universe. But it's about asking questions. And it's about asking questions, again, because of the curiosity. And then what we find, Scott, is we find that scientists then use their imagination to think of ways in which they might be able to learn enough to begin to answer some of those questions. And here's a really great example. I really like this example. The telescopes that are used these days, Webb Space Telescope, Hubble Space Telescope, the Subaru telescopes, the Keck 10-meter telescopes, the Blanco telescopes in South America, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope that's about to open in Chile, and a number of other instruments are all manifestations of using imagination to try to figure out ways to gather information to answer the question. But my favorite is this one. We have space telescopes, right? Well, part of the reason why we have space telescopes is because the atmosphere essentially acts like a dirty windshield, okay? We have to be able to get through the atmosphere to see stuff. And we all know that on a cloudy night or a night when the sky just isn't very clear for whatever reason, we're not going to see the night sky that well. And the bigger the telescope is, the more of a challenge this is. In fact, there's a limit to how big you want to build your telescope for engineering reasons, and then just for the sky factors, things you can't overcome about the sky. So what do? You build a telescope that can go above the atmosphere. Brilliant idea. Great, love it. But wait a minute. if we're using digital photography, I wonder if it's possible to develop a way to model atmospheric turbulence, one of the biggest factors that affects telescopes' ability to see clearly, right? Turbulence in the atmosphere. The bigger the telescope, the worse the turbulence can be. There's no chance of using a big, but if we could model the Earth's atmospheric turbulence and then create an algorithm that would negate that, that we could then use in our digital photography, we've eliminated the atmosphere. Wow. Now what? Now I can build the telescope on the ground as big as I want, and I don't have to add the risk of sending a telescope to space. I don't have to add the expense of sending a telescope to space. I don't have to add the operational difficulties. I can do it right here on the ground. And guess what? It's digital. So now I can just sit back in my living room and watch what's going on in the telescope down in Chile without having to go there. So now what has happened is the imagination has allowed engineers to design a method to circumvent the difficulties that were had by big telescopes, so that now their curiosity can be satisfied about the universe.
And it probably leads to more curiosity.
And of course,
we can go further, we can see farther, we can, you know.
Right, now, but the thing I think that goes really well with poetry and the arts is it's the same sort of
I was going to say
trip
that too.
down the path.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same. It starts with curiosity. You see something, you think of something, you're observing, you get curious about it. You want to know more about it. You want to understand it, describe it, and then your imagination takes off. And sometimes a poem can form just from the seed of seeing an eagle flying across a river in a valley, or a child getting up, sleepy-eyed, waking up and turning on the radio to listen to Derrick Pitts, like my now 26-year-old son used to do. He was a big fan and was really beside himself when he found out that I was going to be interviewing you today. And I'm sure he's watching, actually. He's in Cape Cod right now.
I thought you were going to say he might run screaming from the room when he woke up to hear my voice on the radio.
He was pretty excited about it. But let's talk about those telescopes. Let's talk about the Webb versus the Hubble, because I know there's a difference, first of all, between the photographs.
Sure.
You know, the Hubble seems to be now, at the time, the Hubble was, wow, you know, these photographs are amazing. But now we have the Webb. I've seen a lot of comparisons between the two.
Oh, yes.
And, you know, the Webb seems to look sharper. It looks brighter. There's more detail. And so we've lost a little bit of the, I would say, the romanticism of the Hubble photographs, and then gone for more high resolution, you know. It's sort of like watching a football game, you know, or a baseball game. Those of you who are anxiously awaiting, we will finish before the game, I promise you. I promise you. Maybe we can even put it on the monitors at some point. But, you know, when you're watching on a regular TV, you don't see all the details of the jerseys, you know, or the sweat, or the, you know, whatever. You put on an HD, and wow, it's just, you know, just stuff you don't even want to see. You know, in a football game.
That's right.
But anyway, so let's talk about those. What's your feeling about the differences, and maybe for the audience who aren't familiar with it, we should describe why they're different.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, the differences between a Webb telescope and Hubble Space Telescope really are quite significant, actually. And I, for one, am just overwhelmed by the degree to which improvements have been made in space telescopes. You know, James Webb is, at least an order of magnitude better.
And what's the time frame between the two? When Hubble
was 25 years old.
Only 25 years old. So it's younger than my oldest son.
Yes, younger than your youngest son. But think about it this way: he's had a space telescope in his life, over his entire life. Right. Whereas the rest of us, ancient fossils, you know, couldn't even think about that.
Now watch.
Okay,
My birthday was just the other day. So.
Right. Okay. All right. Oh yes, happy birthday, by the way. Right. Okay. But the difference is really tremendous. But it's a really important difference. And it actually goes right down the line of the arts side, because it's not the artistic nature of the images that I speak of, but what it's really about is the idea of storytelling. And here's what I mean by that. You know, storytelling is really best when it has depth and there are lots of different layers that people can dig into and lots of different entry points. Stories become really rich and they become really wonderful to read when you can see all this in the story itself. And in the story of astronomy and telescopes working, you know, the basic story that we're all most familiar with is the sort of like the original story of the telescope. You have a telescope, you look through it, you see something. But the story has become much richer over the years because the writers, astronomers and engineers, have figured out that I not only have to look at visible light, but I really need to investigate the universe in those other energy regimes that I cannot see. So I need to look at the X-ray, I need to look at the ultraviolet, I need to look at the radio, I need to look at the infrared, because if I can look at those energy regimes, I'll learn something about these phenomenon that tells more of the story. And this is what Webb does. Webb looks at the universe in infrared or heat energy. And I mean heat energy just like you get from the radiator at home, just like you get from the iron, just like you get from anything else that puts out heat, except it's very, very low level. Right?
It's so far away. How does the heat actually get how does that work?
Yeah, this is such a fascinating thing. So an object in space radiates some energy. Maybe it's a very tiny amount of energy. The background temperature of space, by the way, is about 2.7 degrees Kelvin. That's almost absolute zero. But if you had an object radiating at about 5 degrees Kelvin at a distance of 13 million light years away, Webb Space Telescope could detect that temperature difference between the background and the object and make it stand out as if it's brilliant, because the temperature difference for that telescope's capability is so great. So this makes Webb Telescope really important because it now can tell another piece of the story. So Scott, it's
very
not
sensitive. It's more sensitive than Hubble and more.
Oh, it's far more. It's 6 times larger in size than Hubble Space Telescope is. It senses a different energy regime. The resolution of the instrument is far higher than that telescope, than Hubble telescope was. So it can see with much greater discretion. And that's how we get these really detailed images, is because the resolution now is so much higher that it can see these little fine things like little beads of sweat on the athletes that we really don't want to see, but now we can see. Well, it's like that. But these two work together, and they work together in a complementary fashion. James Webb tells an additional piece of the story to Hubble, and now we put them all together.
So they're
and our
connected
stories,
in that way,
they
and
connect.
they share that information, and so the story gets richer.
Story gets
sort
richer.
Of, sort of, you know, as there are a lot of poets who collaborate right together, and so I could see we're feeding off of each other.
And I'll bet you've written poems that started out at one level, and then when you came back to it later, you may have added more to it, and then there's another level.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you come back and add more, and then there's another level.
Yeah, and in fact, most of the people who have talked to me or written about my work have said it's those poems that are the most interesting.
See.
So I might prefer the more simple, more direct, just an imagistic poem about nature and my experience of nature. But people have said again and again, no, I like that. I like your complicated stuff.
Yes.
Because there's more layers and there's more richness to it.
Right.
I'll read one which may be relevant to what we're talking about too.
I think we have some examples of that, don't we?
I think we might.
I even have one.
So this is from a book called Dwelling, an Eco-Poem, which I wrote actually 20 years ago. It was published about 4 years ago. And this is a poem called Redshifting, which in physics, redshift is what happens when, well, you could probably explain it better, but let me
go right ahead. Take a stab at it.
When light from an object is increased in wavelength or shifted to the red end of the spectrum, it's equivalent to a lower frequency. This is my understanding of it. And then a blue shift happens with a decrease in the wavelength typically moving closer to the observer. Would that be accurate?
Yeah.
Fairly accurate?
It's accurate.
Passable.
Passable.
All right, all right.
We'll come back and clean it up later.
I'm not a scientist, nor do I play one on TV. So this is called redshifting. A crow makes its call from a distant tree. Rain soaking the meadow, soaking the earth. Say that surfacing on the wind is as an oak leaf cutting through air. The way the universe expands in space-time with little regard for the matter in its way. A star in the night sky redshifting. Did you see it? As the eye adjusts from blue to green to yellow to red. An object radiates light, moving away from us. Light waves becoming longer, less energetic. Red heart pulsing, wavelength of lower frequency. Then blue heart pulsing out longing. The crow flies overhead, cawing. Its frequency, its pitch, becoming higher when approaching, then lower, longer as it passes, until distance makes the heart's pitch lower too, with absence. Absence being a lower frequency than presence. Say that the heart redshifts down as it reflects light, distance being the time it takes love to travel from star to star, lover to loved. Love is not a vacuum. Its waves bend with its expansion. The heart is as that red star in a field of blue. We cannot know its origin or its destination. But if we think about that place or that absence, we are already there, red shifting through the distance of space-time, or blue shifting, where frequency and proximity collide.
Nice. Very nice.
Thank you. I mean, that was an example of what you were, immediately came to mind when you said, the complicated layers. It did not start out to be that complicated. But
Yeah, it's a beautiful mix.
thank you.
Yeah, it really is very nice. And the science is well done.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that because it's been published and, won an award and everything, and I don't really want
That's
to
good.
revise it.
I think that was a good example of that,
Okay,
yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah,
I mean,
very
I had a lot of experience, as Al alluded to, working with scientists closely in the field with the Nature Conservancy. And I spent a lot of time with them, and I spent a lot of time paying attention to them. So that was the most important thing, I think. So I really, really got to learn a scientific way of thinking and seeing. Tried to incorporate that into my work.
Did any of those scientists talk about storytelling with you?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, it was really interesting because there was one of the scientists, Jim Curatolo, who was he was phenomenal. And he was also a carpenter, really great carpenter. Oh man, so good. But, and he told stories. He was a master storyteller, and he had a million of them. Just great. So it was great to be out in the field with him because, when you're out in the field, there's a lot of downtime. You're waiting for a species to show up, or you're waiting for, something to happen, a change in the landscape, or a turtle to get off its nest, or, whatever, as you're counting eggs. And so, yeah, he would entertain us with a lot of stories, which was great. And then we started collaborating. We would write, we wrote some pieces for the Nature Conservancy where, he had the science part of it and weaved it into a story, and then I would augment that as well. And it worked out quite well. Yeah, it was really great. Oh, and then we had, this was building on that. We had, at one point in the Nature Conservancy, I suggested that storytelling should be a conservation strategy, and that we should learn to tell the stories, not just about the deal that was done. We bought this property of this number of acres for this amount of money, and and this is the species we're saving. But what happened to the landscape? What happened to the people in that landscape? The people who surround it, or the people whose property it used to be, who had a long history there and wanted to see it preserved, and we were able to help them do that. And so we started telling those stories and collecting those stories. But I said, we really shouldn't stop there because we have all these incredible scientists. Let's tell their stories as well. So we would go out to our marine biologists and we would say, what's it like to be out in the field? Or how did you get involved in marine biology? What first piqued your interest? You know, that sort of thing. And we would tell that story, and we put those together in a number of publications over the years. So,
But you're a storyteller. Why is storytelling seem to be important to an audience? Why is storytelling important to humans?
it's the way we've communicated since we could speak. But probably before that, actually. We probably, you know, lots of.
That's how I describe the first sky observer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I think it's elemental to us. It's who we are as a species. I'm sure that other species tell stories. I mean, you see, I live in Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires, and I have a bunch of barred owls that live in the woods across the beaver pond, and they are constantly communicating with each other. And I'm sure there's stories in there. I mean, it's not just, I'm here, oh, I'm here, oh, I'm here, oh, I'm here. You know, there's more nuances to it, and the more you listen to them, and they have different calls and different, you know, songs, it gets more complicated. So I wouldn't be surprised. We can't speak their language, so we're not hearing the stories.
And just as an aside, this makes me now wonder if whales share stories, or if other pinnipeds share stories.
Mm-hmm.
We know they have language.
Yep.
We know they have logic.
Yeah.
And so we know they communicate.
Absolutely. And they are mammals, so we could say,
yes,
you know, okay,
yes.
well, if certain mammals have this capability, then maybe more other mammals have this capability. But birds do too. I mean, you know, crows they're incredible communicators, and I love crows. I'm a big corvid fan, so they're kind of a touchstone species for me. So I spend a lot of time observing crows, and they will tell each other where the good garbage is.
Oh, right. I've heard that.
And they will congregate, and they'll say, hey, come over here, come over here. They've learned to communicate and cooperate in ways that there's definitely, there's stories going on there. There's communication at multiple levels.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And they do it with roadkill too. They say, "Oh, there's a deer over there. Let's go. Come on, everybody."
This
And they
one's
fly
fresh.
over.
Let's
It's fresh, yeah, real fresh. Come on.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So let me ask you, because this is a question I asked Jim Curto. How did you first get into astronomy?
Well, it's always been the night sky. Now, I know that when I was very young, I was extraordinarily curious about the universe and just anything I found fascinating, particularly in anything related to science in general. Just couldn't get enough of it. But astronomy really caught me and grabbed me. And I can't say if there was a seminal moment early on that caught my attention. I know that there was a place for me to put my interest because I'm a child of the 60s. I grew up with the space program, and that gave me a place to focus my interest in astronomy.
It probably captured your imagination, as it did to many people.
It certainly did capture my imagination, there's no question. But I distinctly recall being of two minds at the time. I'm deeply interested in the space program because it's right in front of me. I can see it on television. It's present right there. But I also taught myself how to find out about research astronomy. That wasn't plainly obvious to a kid growing up in North Philadelphia.
Right.
I don't know anything about research astronomers, but I taught myself how to learn about that.
And where did you go to learn about that? Because now you could just Google it. You could get on the internet and you could find information and it take you down a path. But that must have been difficult from North Philly.
In two ways. The doctor's office, our family doctor, had an office around the corner from us, a couple blocks away, and he had a subscription to National Geographic magazine. So whenever I had to go to his office, you wait outside for your turn, I'd pick up the National Geographic and read the National Geographic. And I have to really give this guy credit because he caught on to the fact after a while that I would sometimes just be in the office waiting room reading the
To read
National
the National
Geographic.
Geographic.
Right.
You just stop in just to
I
read
just
it.
stop in just to read that. But he also had Scientific American magazine.
Okay, all right.
Right. Now,
This was a science literate doctor.
he was.
Yeah.
Now, don't ask me why, but for some reason I thought, wow, this is a science magazine. I ought to be reading this science magazine, so let me read it. This is like 12 years old.
Yeah.
I have no idea what's being said in this magazine at all. It is so far above my head.
Right.
I have no idea, but I was deeply fascinated. And I read it anyway.
Mhm.
I read it anyway. And that at
And you
least-
absorbed what you could.
I absorbed
I mean,
everything I
yeah,
could,
yeah.
and that became the avenue for me to pick key words that I can then go look up in a dictionary, in an
Right.
encyclopedia, and now learn what this is and
That
find other
dictionary
resources.
curiosity is huge.
And that's how I began to sort of clearly delineate that. But and that led to my interest in being able to follow what was then the most exciting stuff about the exploration of the universe, which was being able to identify these very interesting objects. I guess in the early to mid 1960s, there were these really curious objects, 3C273. Anybody remember that? 3C273. No? Good guess, though. 3C273 was the catalog identifier number for this object called a quasar.
Oh,
And
quasar.
nobody knew what a quasar was. It's this object in the deep universe that's radiating energy at a greater intensity than anything else. Nobody knew what they were. And I would follow these because the new research, Martin Schmidt out at the 200-inch reflector telescope was trying to get spectra of these objects. Only now that we have better instrumentation, we've come to realize that what we've been seeing in these quasars are cores, the very active cores of galaxies we couldn't see the rest of before.
You just
because
saw the
telescope
pinpoint of it.
No one could see the
Yeah,
pinpoint.
yeah. Oh,
Well, this was
amazing.
deeply fascinating
Yeah.
because it's at the very deepest edge of the universe. So that caught my attention. That pulled me the rest of the way. And I've been fascinated with the universe ever since. I love so many other things in science that I simply can't get enough of. Scott, I feel cheated because I only get to be on the planet for so long.
Right.
And there's so much
There's so
to
much
learn
to
and
see
know.
and learn. Absolutely.
But it's astronomy that really captures my imagination.
Did you have a teacher or anyone that's in school when you were growing up
I had a-
encourage this?
I had a
or-
few teachers,
Yeah.
actually. I had a science teacher in 8th grade. Her name was Beth Showalt. And Beth came to teaching from industry. She was a chemist. And this was the first time I had ever met someone who was completely and unabashedly not only interested in science, but knew the science cold and would not hesitate to demonstrate her vast, deep, and integrated knowledge of it. And she was just a god to me because it's like, oh, a science person. She knows chemistry. I mean, knows chemistry. And so in her 8th grade science class, I excelled. I really did excel. And I got the sense that, wow, she's doing it. You can do it too.
Why not?
And you don't have to hide it you don't have to hide your light under a bushel barrel. either.
Right. Be
No.
ashamed of it or anything like that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Don't have
yeah,
to be ashamed
yeah.
of it. Right.
Yeah, well, I had a similar experience with poetry.
I'll bet.
So I really started getting interested in poetry around the age of 9, believe it or not. It was a woman who helped raise me. She was a surrogate aunt. We called her Aunt Gladys. And she took me under her wing. I was kind of a prodigy of hers. She had been a school teacher, but she was retired. She didn't have any children herself. So she took me under her wing, and she would recite poetry. She would tell me, I'm going to recite a Robert Burns poem. And she would get up there and say, red, red rose, and it was, wow, just blow me out of the water, because it would just come out from deep within her.
And she'd actually put the
Perform
feeling
it.
it, perform
Oh yeah,
it.
perform it.
Wow.
It was remarkable.
Okay.
And I thought, well, that's really cool. That sounds great. It's almost like, rock music or something, you know, the way she did it. You know,
Oh,
reading it on the
yes, yes,
page
yes,
is sort of like, you know, you don't quite get the same experience. But then she would take me outside and we would crawl around in the grass and we would collect leaves and acorns, and then we'd get back to the house and she'd make me match them up and be like, now which acorn goes with which leaf? Which, you know, and she said, what tree did we see that under? You know, what did it look like? Describe the bark. And she had, I mean, this is my formative years too. It was like from the age of 2 to the age of 8, I was like almost her constant companion. And she, so I often say, you know, that book, Everything I Learned in Kindergarten. I often say everything I know I learned from Gladys Taylor, because she turned me on to everything that has continued to be an interest of mine: nature, art, poetry. But then at a certain point when I was a teenager, you know, saying you were a poet or interested in poetry, people would be like, well, okay.
How'd that go?
You know, like, I want to move away.
Yeah.
I played hockey and lacrosse, so I was the, you know, I was the hockey playing poet. I would sit in the back of the bus reading poetry books, and so I was kind of a jock and a nerd at the same time, I guess. You know, I don't know.
You
It was a
were
blend.
multi-talented. That's what you
I think
were.
multifaceted, like most of us are.
Yeah.
But at some point, people try to put us in a box, and they
Yeah,
want
that's
you to
true.
be this.
This is true. Yeah.
But I had teachers then in high school when I really got serious about it. I was around 15, and I was reading everything. I would go to the library, I would take out all the poetry books, I would take out any poetry magazine, anything that said poetry on it, I would take it.
You say at 15?
15.
Wow.
And I had a teacher, David Taddeo, who saw this and just said, an English teacher, and he said, I'm, you know, I know the light bulb went off in his head, I'm encouraging this in him. Right? He ended up publishing my first ever published poem. He published in a little magazine he did in our high school, and this is upstate New York.
Do you have a copy of this?
No, I don't. No, I don't, and thank God. It was probably the worst piece of drivel. You know, I was 15. What could it have said, you know?
Everybody, get out on the internet and do a
Let's
search.
try to find it.
See if you can find it.
It was something about a candle burning. I don't know. It was but anyway, it was. But he noticed that I was reading books. I was always carrying books. I'd come into the classroom, and they had a big dictionary on a you know, podium, and I would go and I would look up a word, and I would look up that word and the definition, and I would think about that word probably more than I was paying attention in class even, and then I'd start playing with the word. I'd write it out. I'd think about it some more. Like try to break it down, and then I was like, oh, I want to know the origin of that word, and then. You know, so every day I was checking a new word. And so he came over to me and he said, what are you reading? And I had this book under my hand. It was probably Allen Ginsberg's Howl or something. And he said, well, if you like that, I think you might like this. It was sort of like Amazon, you know, they're always like suggesting, you bought this, you might want that, you know? And he did the same thing with books. And so he turned me on to a whole new, you know, category of writers who I didn't even know existed. And some of them became really, really influential. And I even got to know a few of them later on in life, which was amazing.
That is amazing.
So
that's great.
So similar. I mean, teachers are so important.
Oh, they
That's
are.
the thing. We don't, you know, they don't get paid enough. They don't get enough respect. But man, we cannot live without them. You know, if we don't have teachers, it's really hard to learn. I mean, you might have, you know, curiosity nerds like us, you know, who are like, oh, I'm so interested in this, and I'm just going to get completely absorbed in it, and I'm just going to take it all in, which can be a problem too.
It can.
But
It's true.
but if you have a teacher who's helping you along and on the path, and like, you know, focus on this, try this, you know, experiment with this, and encouraging you, it's so important. Parents can do it too, but you know, at a certain point, we stop listening to our parents. We just, you know, it's just.
And you know, I really needed teachers. I really needed teachers to set the guardrails and keep me going in the right direction.
Right.
You know,
right.
I mean, you're right. It's great to want to know about everything, but then you can also be scatterbrained at the same time.
Absolutely.
And you know, you need that help to sort of focus you in the right direction and let you know what you should be paying attention to.
Right. Right.
point out the next references and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, so you can follow that path and take it
You
as
can
far
follow
as,
the
as far
path.
as you want to go.
Yes,
As
right.
far as you want to go.
That's right.
I mean, I know plenty of people who wrote poetry at one point, maybe they read it at one point, but now they couldn't be bothered, But others who are really passionate about it, who aren't poets, who aren't writing poetry, but they're very, very passionate about it. So what was the first poem that you loved? If you can remember that. If there was one, maybe there wasn't one. You were too busy with astronomy.
No, I was really fortunate in that, the liberal arts education, that I've had has really shown me some very, very fine literary works. And so I remember a poem that I first heard in high school that was read on a record player. I listened to a record of Richard Burton reciting a poem that was about, the subject matter was about autumn. It's about green and gold. And I'm at a loss to remember the title of the poem now, but I remember that poem really well. I can still hear his voice in my mind.
He could read the phone book.
He could read the phone book, that'd be great. But this really impressed me. And then the next one after that, also in high school, I'm pretty sure, was Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I can still recite.
I brought it because you said that. This was also a very formative poem for me growing up, and so I was reading it the last couple of nights since we talked, reading it again, and yeah, I mean, I don't know, do you want to take a dip or?
It was an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three, by thy long gray beard and withering eye. Now wherefore thou stoppest me? That's the first stanza.
Fantastic.
Yeah, how about that?
That is
okay.
great. That is great.
Not bad. Okay. So no applause necessary, just for money. But that's the first one. And then along with that, there were two others. One I had mentioned before. Believe it or not, I got hooked on the Iliad. It took me. If you've read the Iliad, you can understand that it might
not in high
take
school,
you
but later, because in high
a little
school
bit later.
it's always,
Yeah, right. It might take you a few days to get into it. And it did. It took me a while to get into it. I thought, oh my gosh, am I really trying to read this? This is oh, wait a minute. This is kind of interesting. Let me read some more. And then I really became enamored with English literature, poetry. I'm going to forget the word, the short poem styles.
How many letters?
8 letters.
Like,
it'll come to me in a
like.
second. I spoke before about Robert Herrick.
Yeah.
Writes these short stanza poems that I really enjoy. Sonnets, yes. I became really enamored with sonnets and enjoyed reading so many sonnets. I still keep on my bookshelf at work the 2 volumes of the Anthology of English Literature because it has so many great sonnets and other great writings in it and stuff like that. So one of my favorites from that group is one I mentioned by Robert Herrick, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. And one of the reasons why I like this poem is because on the surface, it speaks of the changing seasons and how one needs to get out and enjoy the season while the weather is warm. But it's really what's described as a carpe diem poem. And the idea is telling you that in your life, you need to get out and enjoy the youth of your life before things start to go downhill. And it's really well written. It's beautifully lyrical and sort of fun to read, but has these hidden messages in it at the same time.
Do you have it by any chance?
Sure, let me see if I can, I think I do have it here. This was, as I said, written by Robert Merrick. It's from 1648. And let me just get it here for you because I have it right over here. To the virgins to make much of time. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may. Old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a-getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. That age is best, which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer, but being spent, the worst and worst times still succeed the former. Then not be coy, but use your time, and while ye may go marry, for having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. Short, straightforward, lyrical, but has these additional meanings. And I just thought, for me, this has that first meaning of get out and enjoy the changing seasons. Then it has the next message about enjoying your life. And then there's the astronomical part on top of it that works for me. That glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, and what the sun is doing and how that describes the seasons of the planet and the seasons of our lives. I think that all kind of works really well together. Not tremendously sophisticated, but.
And in a language that maybe is challenging to some because it was 1648 and now we don't speak like that anymore. But you know, I think with poetry like that, it's important to read it, listen to the sound, read it some more, and
how many times I've read this poem to really get it.
To really get it, really get it.
But
it's not that there's hidden messages. It's not that there's hidden messages. It's just layers, just like in our lives. There's layers. There's not any hidden messages.
We have a layer leaning on us.
Oh,
right
we
now.
do. Oh. Well, no, I have one more question I must ask because my son Jasper sent it to me, and because he couldn't be here tonight, and
Hi, Jasper.
Wow, I think I just scored some points there. So there's actually two questions. I'm gonna ask the first one.
Go ahead. He'll be fine. Don't worry about him.
If you were offered the opportunity to go on the first manned mission to Mars, would you take it, and why or why not?
Interesting question. Absolutely not. No way.
I love that little strategic pause there, like a line break in a poem.
Not a chance. Not a chance. And it's a really very basic reason why. You know, Mars is a one-way trip. You know, right now it's a one-way. It's a one-way
Can't get back
trip.
from there.
It's hard to get back. You know, the plan that's currently in place does make it a round trip thing. I get that, but essentially, it's going to take at least 5 years for a trip to Mars, out and back, with enough time on the planet to make it really worth the long journey, right? But then there are all the other attendant problems, and the one that I love to highlight is this one. You're in a spaceship with 10 of your mission pals. Fabulous. You're on this long journey.
I know
right?
where this is going.
You're tied inside. You can't get outside, and everything's going pretty fine, except that, as it turns out, an axe murderer has slipped through the psychological profile.
That's a line of thinking that my stepdaughter Erica would go.
Go
straight to there.
Yeah,
She'd go
right,
straight
right.
there. No, I'm not even going because one of those people is going to be a murderer. They're going to get me.
And you know, that's extreme. I get it that's really extreme, and I do it, partially for humor. But if you think about what a long journey is like with your family,
5 years,
right?
yeah.
It's bad enough to spend 3 weeks with your family.
And then one of them saying, are we there yet?
Are we there yet?
Are we there yet?
Right. But let's.
Oh, we still got 4.5 years.
Let's think about the practical thing. Okay. So we're on this trip. My appendix bursts. What do?
Oh, yeah.
What do we do?
Hopefully, you brought a doctor.
It's a simple thing to take care. Well, wait. Don't forget the gravity component we have to talk about. It's a simple thing to fix this here on Earth. It takes what, 15 minutes to get your appendix fixed? Right, but
when your appendix floats out of your body and they're trying to get it,
then it's a little bit more of a problem. And so those kinds of practical issues are the things that really bother me.
Yeah.
And I would want to see, I'd go on the third trip maybe. My wife might want me to go on the first trip. I'd go on the third trip, right? So there's that. Okay, go ahead. That was good.
I'd like to give the audience.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Questions because
Definitely.
we're running short on time.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, the photos are about to start. Or
Right.
No, it's like 8:15 probably.
You guys can collect your thoughts because I want each of you to give us some takeaway thoughts. Does anybody have a question? Come on, Dave.
Go, great.
Gravesell.
More on the science side than the art side, a little weaker.
We'll see
on the
about
art
that.
side, but happy birthday.
Tonight, anyway.
I love the storytelling and the layers idea, and it does leave me curious. But Al walked through the dark hallway with the pictures up on the walls, and my wife Sue and I were very interested in the beautiful colors and things like that. And then you mentioned, Derrick, quasars are the centers of galaxies. Are quasars, do they promote so much gravity that they can hold an entire galaxy into its circular rotation?
Yeah.
And do we have that here in the Milky Way?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
I
Let's
want
just
to repeat the question.
Yeah, oh,
for
right. So the question,
viewing
so
audience.
the question for the viewing audience is, are quasars these very, very gravitationally intense centers of galaxies enough that they can hold everything else in the galaxy together? Essentially, did I get it straight? Okay, right. So let's just clarify a few things. Quasars is the term that we used for the cores of supermassive galaxies before we understood that they were the cores of supermassive galaxies. Now that we know what they are, now that we understand what they are, and we can image the rest of the surrounding galaxy well with our instrumentation, we can understand the structure. So now we no longer refer to them as quasars. We simply now identify this as the core of a very distant supermassive galaxy. And we understand that these supermassive galaxies typically are the homes of supermassive black holes. And the supermassive black holes generate enough sort of shock waves from consuming other material in the core of the galaxy that those shock waves, moving out from the center, stimulate the production of stars. And also, there's enough mass at the cores of these galaxies to hold everything there. Last little piece that goes on to that. Vera Rubin very brilliantly determined that galaxies simply do not have enough visible matter to account for their rotational velocity. And she knew there must be something else going on. So she surmised that there was an invisible mass in these galaxies that must be there to give them the rotational velocity. This is now what we know of as dark matter. So you have in galaxies the visible matter, the dark matter, and you have the supermassive black holes at the cores of these big galaxies that have that replace the concept of quasar.
And in the Milky Way, our galaxy?
And in the Milky Way, we have the same kind of mass at the core of our galaxy also that helps to power things and helps things to rotate.
Huh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have time for one more question.
The,
Two more.
Yeah, it's
There seems to be a discrepancy in the Hubble constant, the expansion of the universe. It's like between 68 and 74 parsecs per second or something like that.
Yeah.
The further we look out, the faster things are going.
Yeah.
Aren't we looking back into the inflationary period of the Big Bang?
We're getting really close to that. Yeah, we're getting right on the edge of looking back into the inflationary period. So yeah, we can kind of see into that. So this does cause some complications as far as being able to determine what that number really should be. And so, the best I can say is there's a lot more work that has to be done there. And I say that because, in fact, I can't give you a whole lot of detail about that because I don't live over in that section of astrophysics very much. But I know a little bit, just a little bit, enough to get myself in trouble. And the part where I get myself in trouble, where I come to that wall, is I do know that there's a lot more work that has to be done to define that better, but I don't really get it that well myself yet. So I wish I could tell you more. I can't.
We'll take one from Todd and then Ken. Okay. Todd.
So this one's a little bit more basic. I mean, you obviously come primarily from the art side, you from the science. And Al and I have been talking about the gap. It seems more like a continuum, a Venn diagram, if you will, where you could start with the very technical science and then the very artistic aspect of it. But it kind of blends when you look at science fiction, Arthur Clarke.
Kim Stanley Robinson.
Kim Stanley Robinson, right? Sure.
Add photography,
Mhm.
which kind of bridges it.
Mm,
And then you kind of go from the realism of Derrick, what you do, versus kind of the emotional quadrant, and the blending of that, almost a little bit like a realistic painter, like an Eakins, who in one of his earlier paintings actually measured the angle of the sunlight to capture the rowers, or the distance between the waves, very grounded, but in his latter works became very artistic. On the other hand, you see an Einstein who starts very much in the science world, but towards the end of the life becomes very philosophical in a liberal arts sort of way. So it seems less of a gap and more of a continuum. Do you view it that way, or because you come from different hash marks on the football field?
I don't know about you,
We
Scott.
come from different hash marks on the football field, so I
Right.
think the question was, do we view it as a continuum or a gap between the arts and the sciences? I mean, if you go back to Da Vinci, he had both.
Yeah.
So, you know, and was really, really good at both.
Yeah.
You know, I think of, speaking of realist painters, one of my favorites, a friend of mine, Bo Bartlett. He is very, very precise about what he does with the angles and, you know, using all, you know, very, very, lots of precision in his paintings. But you look at the painting and you don't see the precision, you feel it because the image is so well captured. And now his wife is also a painter, and she is an abstract painter. She uses hot wax and things like that. And sometimes when I see their paintings together, like you know, in a museum or in a gallery or whatever, I see things in her work that look more realistic, and in his work that look more impressionistic. And so they're both sort of working. You know, the materials come into play there, and their training, obviously, but they're both sort of working in this way of like marrying the science and the art, maybe without even thinking about it. I know Bo spends a lot of time with making his images very, very precise. But what do you think?
I like to look at one period of art I really enjoy is Renaissance art. And most of the reason why I enjoy it is because I love to see how it is that perspective emerges in the Renaissance in artwork. And that is because of the mathematics that go into the composition of the painting. And then the paint work is so beautifully done on top of that. The subject matter is expressed so beautifully, even in that. So for me, what I tend to see a lot of is a lot of false dichotomies set up about science is over here and art is over here. Well, if I sit and listen to Carlos Santana play a guitar, I can hear the mathematics in his head as he's playing. And if you listen to Bach, you can hear the same thing. So for me, I don't believe that they are separate. I believe that they cross over to a tremendous degree. And we don't take the time, or we don't bother to separate or to see the blend of the two as often as it is present. So for me,
in our schools, we separate it.
Oh, in our schools, we
there's all the science over here, there's art over here. Art's usually an elective,
right?
You know,
right.
and
you can't
so
get this if you're in that track
exactly,
and things
exactly.
like that.
And I think that's wrongheaded. I think that is really where it's a false dichotomy. I think I would totally agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think, like for instance, my stepson Max, he wanted to go into mathematics, wanted to do applied mathematics, and found that it was incredibly hard, so he got a business degree instead. But he had a love of art and an understanding of art, which I remember him explaining the mathematics, just what you were describing about perspective and what have you. And I'll never forget that. But then he's now working in a gallery in Glendale, California. You know, so he graduated from UCLA, and he's moving into the art world on the business side of it, but he's still the appreciation of the art.
If you listen to Indian sitar music played by Ravi Shankar, and you listen to the drummer Billy Cobham play, all you hear is mathematical formulas.
Right.
That's all you hear. But then it's expressed in this beauty of the music that they produce. And you can't help but see how all this sort of
Comes
moves
together.
together.
Right.
And for me, I have that kind of, I really like to hear that.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm gonna hold off because it's gonna go down the rabbit hole of dark matter, and I don't think.
The dark matter rabbit hole? We may have to take that outside.
We can talk afterwards.
I want each of you to take just a few seconds or a minute or so. Give us a takeaway from your point of view so that our viewers can tune into the Phillies Astros.
It's ironic that the Astros are playing tonight, right?
It is, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
You know. I like that.
So I think one of the things I'd ask people to think about going away from this is to look at your world in a way that allows for the emergence of the art in science and also allows the emergence of science in art. To make it much more apparent that it's not just STEM, but it is really STEAM. In fact, there are so many scientists who are artists, and there are so many artists who are scientists. This helps helps us see the incredible richness of the world if we can see these different layers in the world around us. And I think that can't help but sort of improve or augment your experience of existence in the world. You can even see it if you look at a beautiful fall day. My last thing,
Absolutely.
This is perfect for me. It always works great. For me, there's something exquisite about the wavelength of green light put against the wavelength of yellow leaf light against the wavelength of blue sky light. That green, that yellow of the tree leaves, and the blue. I'd like to think that humans are hardwired to love
Respond to that, absolutely.
to respond to that.
Absolutely.
But
I
it's
think that's
about
true.
it's about the wavelengths and these detectors that are tuned for that, for those wavelengths. For me, that puts all of that together.
I couldn't build on that. So, I mean, I'll just say two things. One, just don't fear science and don't fear poetry. Give it a shot. You know, start small. Don't, just read it out loud, listen for the sound. Donald Hall, who was a mentor of mine, used to say, you have to feel a poem in your mouth. And so read it out loud, and don't even think, I don't necessarily need to know what this means. Just enjoy the sounds, enjoy the rhythms, enjoy, maybe the images, And then I'm just going to finish with a poem because Al's wife Barb said that I absolutely have to read another poem. So I'm going to read a poem that's appropriate for the area. So I've struggled with the night sky for most of my life, trying to see it. I'm trying to see, like, I can see the Big Dipper, I can see the Little Dipper, but this is partly why when Al asked me to take on this role, I was like, yeah, because I want to learn more. And I want to be able to see the images and know what I'm seeing and understand it. So, but one of the things I would go camping, I'd take these charts, on flashcards, and I would hold them up to the sky, and I would look, and I'd be like, okay, well, it's supposed to be here, but is that right? I don't know. Oh, maybe I have it upside down, and then it was really hard. But then I found this app called the Night Sky app, and that helped unlock a lot. And so one day I used to have an apartment in Philly and with my twins, and I was just playing around with the app. It was dark out and cloudy, and I couldn't really see anything out the window. And so I just took the app and I was looking around. Well, what would I see if I saw here in the apartment? I was kind of looking around with it, and it gives you the image that you see through the lens of your camera, but also the night sky and what's there. So you see the International Space Station kind of floating along. You see where the planets are, and so I was kind of playing around with that. And this was the result of it. And it's dedicated to the memory of David Simpson, who was a wonderful poet who died in 2015, a great friend of mine. He and his brother, you may have heard of them because they're kind of famous for being the blind twin poets. And his brother Dan is still around, has a wonderful new book out, but David is no longer with us. So this is for David. Apt to the stars. I can't see the stars tonight in cloud cover and city night glare. So I double tap on my night sky app, making missing stars revealed. Virgo hiding behind the corner of the apartment building, illuminated, first in outline, then sketched in white on black. Woman holding back nothing, at least until she fades from view. Moving my iPhone to the left, aiming just below horizon, the moon appears, unrisen. Swinging my view to the apartment above, Ursa Major hangs, looming. Back down from ceiling to floor, I see the sun, a good 8 hours away. Man, there's a lot of space junk up there, rocket bodies and satellites. But it's a series of random names and numbers, a cipher, a type of code, indicating stars we've shared our universe with for eons. Fascinates me most. NGC 5466, KRAZ, PCEN, 17 CRT. Now panning with my phone facing me, spinning around and around the room, swinging away from star to star, dizzying with every swipe, every turn, my head full of stars, planets, galaxies. Now, thank you for coming, and thank you for being here, and thank you for having me. And thank you, Derrick.
Thank you very much.
Really a pleasure.
It's great fun.
It's a pleasure.